these national security wiretaps was in the last year of President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy's administration in 1963. Now, that doesn't mean that what they did was wrong. It doesn't mean that what has happened in the past justifies what happened, what we did. What I am suggesting here is that the reason we wiretapped was that the leaks were making it very difficult to conduct our foreign policy. We had a lot of things going on then. We had, for example, a new relationship that we were attempting to develop with the People's Republic of China. It was just in its early stages. We had relationships with the Soviet Union. We were having, of course, discussions on a confidential basis with regard to Vietnam. But I should point out that the leak which disturbed me the most happened to be the leak of the secret bombing. Because it cost American lives.
Because it cost lives. You made your first speech to the American people on the subject of Vietnam on May
27th.
I think in May of 1969. It's a speech that you were not happy with. Why not?
Well, it was a speech that had been prepared by the NSC staff, and it was written in the typical State Department kind of unintelligible rhetoric. Now, I don't consider myself to be a particularly brilliant writer, but I've had enough experience, I think, to know how to say something very simply to get it across. And from that time on, all the speeches I made during the war, I took as much assistance as I could get from the State Department and the NSC staff, but I rewrote them all to put them in language that people could understand. Oh, that was, excuse me, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No. As far as the substance of the speech was concerned, I think it should be noted, too, that it was a very conciliatory speech, but it was one that did not have the impact that I would have liked in rectifying what Johnson had done. What had happened there is that he had never gotten across to the American people as to why we were in Vietnam. He tried to, but he never made it as plain as he might. Too many American people had the impression we were in Vietnam solely for the purpose of seeing that Vietnam had an opportunity to have a democratic government. Now, that was important to us, but that wasn't the major reason. He didn't point out the great stakes that were involved in Vietnam, and he had not leveled with the American people on what it would be required to bring this to a successful conclusion. I felt it was necessary to do that, and it was later on that I was able to make those points more effectively.
During the summer of 1969, the domestic anti-war protest began to heat up. It was clear that the honeymoon with the new administration was over. October 15th was designated as Moratorium Day, and the idea was that the 15th of each succeeding month would be another moratorium until that had affected your actions and you'd withdrawn the troops and ended the war. How did this escalating domestic protest affect your thinking about the war or your conduct of the war?
Well, the protests had exactly the opposite effect from what the protesters intended. They protested against the war. Well, we were all against the war. We wanted to end it. It was a question of how. They wanted to have peace, and they wanted to stop the killing, of course. What happened here was that by their protests, they prolonged the war because they encouraged the enemy. And the enemy themselves said that when they congratulated those that were running the October 15th moratorium and said, may your October offensive be very, very successful. And it did have that effect. Now, let me say another reason, however, that I was particularly concerned about this protest, the one on October the 15th, is that we had a synchronized, orchestrated policy in place that we thought would bring meaningful negotiations with the North Vietnamese. I had written a letter to Ho Chi Minh, one which he gave a curt reply to, but which at least opened a channel.
Was this known publicly?
Oh, yes, it became known then, and became known shortly thereafterwards. I had also initiated talks with the Soviet Union through a contact with Ambassador Dobrynin, in which I laid it on the line as to where we stood with regard to their involvement in supporting the North Vietnamese. I thought that they could bring some pressure to bear, of course, on the North Vietnamese. Dr. Kissinger, in August of that year, had begun the first of 12 secret trips that he took to Paris to negotiate in a private channel with the North Vietnamese, Le Duc Tho. In addition to that, I had taken other actions on the diplomatic front and otherwise to indicate that on the one side, we wanted to make a reasonable settlement, provided it was one that did not require us to overthrow the Thieu government or the government selected by the people of South Vietnam. But on the other side, that if we were unable to get that kind of a settlement, that we were prepared to take the military action to bring the war to a conclusion. But that became an empty threat, believe me, after the October 15 moratorium, because what happened then was it encouraged the enemy not to negotiate seriously, and they didn't for a considerable amount of time after that. And of course, with all of that kind of disruption in the nation's capital and across the country, because this wasn't the only place that it occurred, I knew that it would tear the country apart to escalate militarily, as I'd hoped we would be able to do in the event that the enemy continued to be intransigent.
Do we know that the North Vietnamese or the NLF followed our domestic political scene and were aware of the anti-war protests?
Oh yes, we are very much aware of that.
How do we know that?
We know it too from an historical standpoint. The war in Vietnam, as far as the French was concerned, was not lost in Vietnam. It was lost in Paris. The French still, after the great loss in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, had substantial military superiority, and they could have won it had their political base stood up in Paris. Now, the North Vietnamese, if nothing else, are historians. They think historically, as do most communists and communist leaders. And when they saw what had happened in France, they thought the same thing could happen in the United States. They couldn't win on the battlefield in Vietnam. They couldn't win particularly as Thieu was beginning to develop the South Vietnamese forces, which could carry the load themselves even after we withdrew. And so what they could not win on the battlefield against American and Vietnamese forces, they hoped to win in Washington, D.C. And that is why they conducted these campaigns of propaganda, demonstrations, and so forth all over the nation in order to force capitulation in Washington, to win politically what they could not win militarily.
We have on film some scenes from typical anti-war protests of those years. As you say, these protesters unwittingly upset the plans you had put in motion for peace. How do you feel about these protesters today, looking back on that experience?
Well, no, first of all, I would say that's about as untypical a picture of those protesters as I could possibly imagine. That shows the kind of protests that the media tried to paint of the protest movement generally. Peaceful people walking along, carrying coffins, demonstrating peacefully. Let's understand what kind of protest it was. It was violent. Some of it was peaceful, but a lot of it was violent. And in Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage was done. We have to understand, too, that all over the nation, for example, in 1969 alone, there were, as I recall, 40,000 bombings or threats of bombs. In that period, too, there were over 250 cases of arson, and there'd been 86 people killed. This was a rough period. This was not a non-violent protest. Excuse me.
One American politician said that the best young Americans during that period went to Canada, not to Vietnam. How do you react to a statement like that?
Well, I was in Vietnam in July of 1969. And I had been there, of course, on 6 other different occasions. I went out among the troops in the battlefield. I was enormously impressed and frankly moved by them. They're just fine young men. And I realized as they were there that over 2.5 million young Americans served in Vietnam. They came back, as we know now, usually unappreciated and sometimes even condemned, ostracized. And under the circumstances, it had to be a very bitter experience for them. But I can tell you what I feel about it. Our best young men didn't go to Canada. They went to Vietnam. These young fellows, most of them didn't have college educations, not because they were stupid or dumb, because probably they didn't come from families that could afford it. But they served their country, they did their job, and I feel that the country owes them what they have not received to date. That is appreciation for what they've done.
How do you feel about the mindset behind a statement like, our best young men went to Canada, not to Vietnam?
Well, this is what we call the higher morality. It's the idea that there are some people who are better educated than others, and certainly better educated than whoever happens to be the elected leaders of the country, who should determine what is just and what is unjust in terms of America's political and military commitments around the world. And if they determine that something is unjust or unwise, then they consider that those who protest against it, even though they violate the law, are heroes, and those who serve are really people that do not deserve our appreciation. Well, I don't accept that. We can't have a country that can be a major force for good in the world, as the United States, in my view, has been and will continue to be, if we have that kind of anarchy in the intellectual community.
It's also been argued that Vietnam was a racist war on our side, to the extent that whereas middle class and upper middle class white young men were able, for various reasons, either by going to Canada or obtaining student deferments, were able to avoid service, the average soldier was black, was Hispanic, was poor, was uneducated. Is there validity to that charge?
To a certain extent, yes. It wasn't intended, of course, but that's the way the draft law had been written, and under the circumstances, people could avoid service. It wasn't illegal to, by getting education and through other kind of deferments. I think in the future, of course, in the event, and I hope we don't ever have that, have to face up to that again, that has to be modified or rectified, because it isn't right to have some people pay the price and others, frankly, have a free ride. I recall, for example, a confrontation I had in the 1970 campaign. I was in New Jersey, I believe it was, and I was going in to address a meeting of one of the political meetings in a governor's race or something up there. No, I'm sorry. This is New Jersey in 1970. I was addressing a political meeting, and a young fellow came up to me and grabbed me by the arm, said he was a student. Well, I guess he was, although from his age I think he'd been in college a long time. But he said, stop this war in Vietnam. And I said, have you ever been to Vietnam? He said, no. I said, well, look, there are a lot of young people out there in Vietnam fighting so that you won't have to go.
Do you think that a white middle class or upper middle class young American at that time who took advantage of that position or of the loopholes in the law to avoid service was a less good American for doing that?
No, not at all. I'm not going to sit here and judge them as they judge those who served. or as they may judge me. No, the draft law is the law, and I don't think that we have to assume that an individual isn't going to do what's in his best interest. Who wants to go out there and get his tail shot off? Who wants to take that kind of risk? Who wants to have his life interfered with? So they had a right to do that. I understand that. What I do not understand, however, is for some like that to have engaged in demonstrations, to take out, if they had a sense of guilt, their sense of guilt by attacking those who did serve, in effect, by attacking what they call an unjust war, and in effect looking down on those who were stupid enough to have not avoided service.
Do you think that the communists were behind in any way the anti-war movement?
Oh, there's no question that they were behind it. However, I would have to say that the anti-war movement had a life of its own. It was made up of a number of different groups. For example, there were those I just referred to, individuals who just didn't want to get shot at, and I don't blame them a bit. I understand those. And then there were some very honest pacifists, the Quakers, for example, of which I happen to be one, not a very good one. But nevertheless, they're against all wars. But there are two kinds that I don't have any use for whatever. One, there are those who got the United States into the war in Vietnam, the brightest and the best, who urged that we get in, and then had the war conducted their way, gradual escalation, and win it in economic areas rather than on the battlefield and so forth. And then once it began to go sour, they turned on Johnson and later on me and sabotaged my efforts particularly to get us out in an honorable basis. And then finally, there is one other group. These are people that were not in government, but they are what we call our better intellects in the country, in the great universities, in the foundations, most of them, of course, in the media as well are in this category, who felt always that they, in effect, were the best thinkers about American foreign policy. They supported what we did in World War I. They supported what we did in World War II, to a certain extent even in Korea. But when it came to Vietnam, they bugged out. And as a result of that, they, in effect, left a legacy, which I think they're finding very hard to live down, because they know they failed the country, failed to exert the leadership that they could in a very desperate time. Let me point out why. It isn't because I question their patriotism. It isn't because I question their sincerity, but I question their judgment, just as I question the judgment of the protesters. They wanted to end the war. Well, if they wanted to end the war, what they should have done was to support the government that was trying to end it, and the only government we had at that time that was trying to end it, rather than to sabotage our efforts to end it, which we were trying to do on an honorable basis. And I question their judgment in another way. When they said that the war was one that it didn't make any difference who won. History has disproved them. What has happened to Vietnam since the United States left? What has happened since the South Vietnamese, after holding on for 2 years, were denied the support they needed to resist the attack from the north? What has happened there has demonstrated that the cause that we were there, even though we may not have conducted ourselves too well in achieving it, was a just cause. We were attempting to prevent what has happened since. And I make the point again that I have made on previous occasions. More people since the fall of Vietnam and the fall of Cambodia were killed in Cambodia alone and starved to death, 2 to 3 million, than were killed in the 25 years that the French, the Americans, and the South and North Vietnamese had fought in Vietnam. So we were on the right side. And these people in the great educational institutions, in the media, some even in the business community and the rest, that have this higher morality, they carry a great burden for bugging out on the leadership position which they should have provided here. Rather than opposing, they should have supported what we were trying to do.
Your November 3rd speech was one of the most extraordinary moments of your presidency, even one of the most extraordinary moments of contemporary political history. You went on television and defined a whole new political constituency and then rallied it to do something that few thought possible, to support continued fighting of the war. We have a clip from that famous silent majority speech.
So tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
How did you plan and write that speech, and did you have any idea it would have the effect that it did have?
Well, first we got to look a little at the background. We had had the October moratorium, as I pointed out earlier. That had destroyed any chance for us to escalate militarily. And another moratorium was planned, or they called it something else, a mobilization, I believe, on November the 15th. So under the circumstances, I knew it was necessary to address the nation. I think what made the speech a success was first the tactics I used in presenting it. I remember I drove my staff right up the wall. They came to me almost every hour and said, the press is really complaining that they don't have an advance copy. I said, don't give them an advance copy, because I want to talk directly to the American people. I knew that 90% of the press was against what we were doing in Vietnam, and I knew that if they got an advance copy, they would destroy, by putting out earlier what I was going to say and by giving their arguments against it, they would destroy the effect of it. So I gave no advance text. I also did not give an advance text to members of my staff, except just a few minutes before I went on. I informed everybody concerned what I was going to say without going into all detail in every respect. I did most of the writing with a great deal of help, incidentally, from our NSC staff, from Henry Kissinger and others, but I did the writing at Camp David. And that's where, very late at night, I think it was 2 a.m. in the morning, the silent majority theme came into my mind. Not that it's so brilliant, but as I pointed out in that speech, here we had demonstrations going on all over the country. We had people indicating that our brave young men, our best young men, were going to, were not in Vietnam, but that's right, they were going to Canada rather than in Vietnam. But under the circumstances, I therefore tried to accomplish three things. First, I deliberately in advance did not try to put down speculation as to what I was going to say. Some senators were speculating that I was going to announce a major withdrawal of forces. Others said I was going to announce a ceasefire. Others said that I was going to announce more conciliatory attitudes toward the demonstrators, toward the North Vietnamese, and so forth and so on. I didn't discourage any of that at all. So by the time I went on, it built the biggest audience that I had up to that time in the presidency, and I think the biggest television audience that any president has had up to that time. And they heard it directly from me rather than through the media, which of course would not have presented it the way that I wanted to come through. And after hearing it from me, it had a dramatic effect because the mail just poured in, not as stimulated as some of our critics would indicate, but it poured in spontaneously, such as you've never heard. It had just three major themes in it. One, I did what I felt Johnson had not done adequately. I tried to tell the American people what the stakes were, that it didn't involve just what happened to the people of Vietnam, but what happened to the people in the rest of Southeast Asia, what happened to the United States as well. Second, I told them what we were trying to do in a way of bringing the war to a conclusion, a program of Vietnamization. That means, in effect, that we were going to withdraw American forces at the same time that we were training the South Vietnamese forces to take over their own defense. And that program eventually was carried out, and carried out successfully. And third, I made this point very clear, that our policy was not going to be changed, it wasn't going to be affected by demonstrations in the street. I pointed out that I didn't question the right of people to demonstrate, but on the other hand, that as far as a president is concerned, he must make up his mind, after getting the best advice from his associates as to what is best, and then follow that course of action. And that is why I concluded with the line, our policy isn't going to, in effect, going to be made in the streets, it's going to be made under our constitutional process by the administration, and I called on the silent majority to support him, and the silent majority was out there. Our approval rating went up to 68% right after that, right in the midst of a war and in spite of huge demonstrations. What I was really trying to get across was this, that despite the fact that the media was overwhelmingly against the war, despite the fact that many members of Congress were making great noises to the effect that the war ought to come to a conclusion on any terms whatever, despite the fact that we had demonstrations, thousands of them, that were very loud, that was not the voice of America. The voice of America was the silent majority. And that sustained me, as a matter of fact, throughout the 4 years until we got the peace agreement in January of 1973.
In addition to enhancing impact and preventing leaks, was one of the reasons you kept the text of the speech from your staff because you suspected that many, if not a majority of them, would have disagreed with the decisions you had made?
Oh, there's no question that some of them would have disagreed with it. However, I wasn't paranoid enough, as some would have suggested, to distrust them and feel that they'd run out and give it to the press. But I also knew that it's a great temptation to any staff member, if he's got a friend in the media and the media fellow says, look, just for my own information, just so I don't say what is wrong here, could you just give me a little fill-in, just guide me in the right way? Of course, that's a come on, and there's so many suckers in Washington then, and there still are today, that can be taken in by that kind of approach. So I just wasn't going to take any chances. It was better for them not to know. And if there's going to be any leaks, then I would be responsible because I was the only one that knew.
On April 20th, 1970, you went on television and announced, gave a very optimistic progress report about Vietnamization. You announced that 150,000 troops were going to be withdrawn over a period of time. 10 days later, on April 30th, you went on television and shocked everybody by announcing an American military action into Cambodia. Your critics said that the only thing that changed between those 2 days, the 20th and the 30th, was that you saw the film Patton twice. What did change, and why did you feel it was necessary to expand the Vietnam War into neutral Cambodia?
Well, first, the business about Patton, I recommend everybody to see it if you can still see it on a cassette or someplace. I like Patton not because of what it told about war, but what it told about people. The character sketches of not just Patton, but Eisenhower, who doesn't even appear on film. You only see him through references by others. Montgomery, Bradley. It's like War and Peace. War and Peace, Tolstoy's great novel, I liked because of what it told about people rather than about war and peace. But what really had happened, of course, that required the action that we took in April 30th was that in Cambodia, so-called neutral Cambodia, there was a chance that it was going to become very unneutral. Because what had happened was that Sihanouk, who, of course, had run a neutral government and had a relatively neutral policy, tilting it more, of course, to the communists than to us, but nevertheless relatively neutral, he had been overthrown by a very pro-Western government under Lon Nol. Once that happened, then the North Vietnamese launched a major attack in Cambodia aimed at Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. and they threatened to overrun all of Cambodia, which would have meant that these sanctuaries bordering on Vietnam that we had bombed in 1969, that they would be expanded to the whole country. This would be a threat to our forces in Vietnam that I consider to be unacceptable. We already had very high casualties as well as a result of those hit-and-run raids. Now, when you say we invaded neutral Cambodia, that's like saying Eisenhower invaded France when he went into Normandy, or that the British invaded Holland when they went across at the time that those were German-occupied territories. All we did was to move into that part of Cambodia that was totally occupied by the North Vietnamese and by the Viet Cong, by the enemy. There, as far as we knew, and nobody I think has really questioned this, there were no civilians, only a few, if any at all. And so the purpose there was to knock out these sanctuaries, to save American lives, which we did, and second, to allow our withdrawal program, which I had announced 10 days before, to go forward. Because in the event that the North Vietnamese had been able to take over all of Cambodia, we would have had to increase the number of people, Americans, in Vietnam in order to avoid a total defeat for the South Vietnamese.
The next morning, you went to the Pentagon for a briefing on the military action in Cambodia. While you were there, you decided to go for broke and take out all the sanctuaries. What made you make that decision?
Well, they showed a map of Cambodia in the briefing. And I noted the two sanctuaries we went into. One is called the Fishhook, and the other was called, interesting enough, Parrot's Beak, both of them digging into South Vietnam, of course. And I noticed there were 4 others, and I said, what about those? And they said, well, we don't know that we have the capability of doing it. We think we have, but we wonder, the general who was briefing me on it, about the political effect of going in. I said, listen, leave the politics to me. I said, if we can do it militarily, I want them all taken out. We're going to get just as much political heat for taking out some as we can for taking out all. Let me say in that respect, the military are not particularly imaginative or creative. Generally in war. That isn't to reflect on them as people, it's just the way they were, and particularly in this war, because they had become gun-shy during the Johnson years, when they had to fight with one hand, in effect, behind their back, when they couldn't come up with imaginative ideas because it would be turned down because of the political effect that it would have. I made it very clear in this briefing that from now on, politics was not going to determine the way we conducted this war. We were going to do what was right, to bring it to an end, to continue our withdrawal program, and to save American lives. It was a good decision, and it eventually worked, of course, because we did save lives, and we also prevented a Tet Offensive for that year.
As you left the Pentagon that morning, a very dramatic scene developed. You were surrounded in the lobby by well-wishers, and in an impromptu exchange of remarks, you referred to the protesting college students as bums. Given the intense reaction to your Cambodian action, wasn't that a very provocative remark?
Well, let's understand how it happened. I not only was surrounded by well-wishers, but one woman came up to me and she said, thank you very much for ordering the incursion into Cambodia because my husband is serving out there with the units that are under attack. And by what you've done, I think you may have saved his life. And I said, you know, I've been to Vietnam. And I said, those men that are serving out there, you can be very proud of them. They are the greatest. I said, you know, our college students are the luckiest people in the world. Here they are in the United States while others are serving out there. And here they are burning books and wait a minute. Is it bombing? Not bombing. No. I'll start again. And here are college students in contrast. They're the luckiest people in the world. But what are they doing? They're blowing up the place. They're burning books. And I said, that's simply hard to understand. They're really a bunch of bums. Now, in other words, I was not referring to all demonstrators as being bums or all college students being bums. I was referring to those that were blowing up the campuses and also that were burning books and so forth and so on. But let's look at the context of that too. Up until that time, in the whole year of 1969 until April of 1970, we'd had a number of bombings, until 1970, until April of 19, I'll start again on that. From the time I came into office in 1969 until April of 1970, at that time there had been a total of 1,800 demonstrations on college campuses. But worse, there had been 250 cases of arson. There had been over 600 injured, 2/3 of them being police, and in addition to that, there had been at least 8 killed. And then I had had one very dramatic episode just 3 or 4 days before, which brought it home to me. The demonstrators had burned a research institute in Stanford University. A visiting Asian scholar, a noted anthropologist, had a 25-year research project that he'd been working on there burned, destroyed, a whole lifetime's work. And it just seemed to me this was so senseless, so mindless. I understood people being against the war, but bombing and burning and destroying like that, it seemed to me, was totally unacceptable. They were bums, and I'd say it again if I were to had a chance.
Within a matter of days, campuses all across the country were either up in turmoil or closed down. Marches on Washington were planned or underway. And then an event happened which added a whole new dimension of tragedy to this situation. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops fired into a group of student demonstrators and killed 4 of them. How did you first hear about this?
Well, in fact, I was in the EOB going over some scheduling decisions I had to make, and Bob Haldeman came in from his office from next to the Oval Office and told me they had just gotten this news with regard to a possible deaths. He didn't know how many at that point. And I must say that it was as shocking an event as I had during the time I was in presidency.
There's a striking photograph of that event at Kent State, which seems to summarize all the anguish that people felt. How do you feel when you look at this photograph?
Well, I feel as I did when I saw it, because I did see it in the newspaper. It was an emotional, wrenching experience for me. Certainly the most emotionally wrenching experience I had during the entire period of the presidency, more so even than the resignation. Because you see that a girl like that, you see, of course, the young man down there, probably dead, and you think of your own children. I remember, for example, one of the girls who was shot and killed at Kent State. Her father made a statement to the effect, "My daughter was not a bum." And I thought of my own daughters. I thought back of the learning to talk and to walk and their first birthdays and the trips we took together, going to the ball game with one and to the circus with others and so forth and so on, getting them through the teenage years, getting them through college and so forth and so on, and then all gone. And I therefore felt great responsibility for what had happened. I also felt a great deal of anger for those who had done what brought about this sort of thing. And let's understand that this was not just a case of a group of hard-nosed military people shooting down innocent students. Some of those who were killed were certainly innocent. One was even a bystander. But before this happened, Kent State had been virtually a battleground. The Governor Rhodes, had to call in the National Guard because of the arson that was going on all over town. Just a couple of days before this, They threw lighted flares into the ROTC building, burned it to the ground, $1 million worth of damage. When the fire department came, they cut the hose with machetes so that they couldn't put out the fire. And then they threw rocks at the firemen and injured several of them. Then when all the demonstrations were banned by court order, they continued, and when the National Guard was trying to quell the demonstrations, they threw rocks at the guard and threw the tear gas canisters which had fallen among them. They began to throw those at the guardsmen and drove them back onto a hill. And then, unfortunately, a tragic thing occurred. These young guardsmen, who were the same age they were, as a matter of fact, one of them fired, and 4 people were dead. It was a tragedy. It is one that I, of course, feel felt great responsibility for, but I understood, and therefore particularly was disturbed by those that had brought it on, in my opinion, by the kind of actions that they were inspiring.
Your action into Cambodia also elicited considerable support. There's another photograph which I think is a favorite of yours. What does this photograph remind you of or bring back to you?
Oh yes, I see that. These are what you call the hard hats. I've already indicated that it was very difficult to keep the country together during this war. I could only do it because of the support of the silent majority and because of the support of a number of members of the Congress in both the House and the Senate, Democrat and Republicans, and they constituted a majority who did support what I was trying to do, although the minority made most of the news. But we had the opposition of the media. We had the opposition of the best minds in the universities. We had the opposition of many in the business community. All of the so-called, or most of the so-called intellectual elite, the so-called better people, were against what we were doing in Vietnam. They thought it was an unjust war, that we shouldn't be there, and that in any event we should get out, whatever the cost might be. And yet, among those that did stand by me were those that weren't supposed to be listened to. The hard hats, of course, are working people. They are members of the unions who get out and work on the buildings and so forth. Most of them don't have college educations. Most of them are considered to be Archie Bunker type that are too stupid to pay any attention to. But believe me, they have guts, they got backbone. One of the great problems sometimes in our education today, we're overeducated people sometimes. And what we do is to strengthen the brain and weaken the backbone. Well, these people had brains, a lot of them. They didn't have the opportunity to develop as some of our people in college did. But they still had a strong bent of patriotism and support of our men, many of whom, of course, they knew in Vietnam. And so under the circumstances, I appreciated what they'd done. Without their support, we couldn't have hung on as long as we did, because the so-called better people bugged out.
On June 13th, 1971, you looked at your Sunday New York Times. On the left-hand side of the front-hand page, you read about the coverage of your daughter Tricia's wedding. And in the middle of the page, you saw a headline about a series of government documents that the Times was about to begin publishing. This was the first appearance of what became known as the Pentagon Papers. Did you have any idea that this was coming? Were you prepared for it? And what were the Pentagon Papers?
No idea whatever. I was very surprised and shocked. And of course, Henry Kissinger was just as surprised. I remember he called me at Camp David expressing consternation that this had occurred. The Pentagon Papers, about 7,000 pages of classified secret and top secret documents and a study which had been made from those documents, prepared during the Johnson administration by Secretary of Defense McNamara as to how we got into the war in Vietnam, how it was conducted. It was, and frankly, a critique of the war. That's what the Pentagon Papers was.
The finger of suspicion quickly pointed to Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, a former Defense Department employee who was a consultant to the Rand Corporation and had access to those documents. He admitted that he had taken them and distributed them. We have a clip of one of his press conferences. What are your feelings about Daniel Ellsberg and what he did?
Well, Daniel Ellsberg, I do not question what he was trying to do in terms of his sincerity, if I may use a very overworked term. But I certainly question his judgment, and I question the basic, frankly, morality of what he did. After all, he is putting himself above the President of the United States, above the Congress, above our whole system of government, when he says, in effect, that he would determine what should be made public. And also, from that clip, it indicates that he not only was not satisfied with what he had done in terms of putting out the records of what had occurred before this administration, our administration, had come into power, but that he would like to get out the records with regard to what we had done in Cambodia and in Laos, which he, again speaking, says was in violation of the UN Charter and so forth. Now, it is not for him, who was a former government employee, to make that decision. I think his decision was wrong. I think he was wrong, for example, on insofar as his evaluation of the situation. But assuming he was right, that is not our system. It is not our system for people who have been in government to take secret documents and illegally to make them available to the newspapers and, in effect, thereby to give aid and comfort to the enemy. So some people say, was he a traitor or was he not? It's really beside the point. There's no question that these documents were valuable to the North Vietnamese and valuable to the Russians, as Dean Rusk said, and also that they gave aid and comfort to the enemy.
There is an argument that the Pentagon Papers were sort of a red herring, that in fact they were verbose, wordy, academic, that most of the material was already available in non-classified places, that they were the best argument for studying the classification of documents, and as a matter of fact, in the wake of the publication of the Pentagon Papers, your administration initiated an entire government-wide study of reclassification. What about the argument that the Pentagon, looking back, do you think that the government's reaction to the publication of the Pentagon Papers was an overreaction?
Not at all. I wish we could have done more. Because if you ever give the seal of not at all. I wish we could have done more. Because if you ever give the approval to this kind of action, you're going to have a chaotic situation in the government. You simply aren't going to be able to run it. I would say, too, that when people suggest, and I think Secretary of Defense Laird said that 95% of them probably didn't need to be classified. 5% is enough to break a code. And for example, looking at that, I remember the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, in expressing their concern about the Pentagon Papers, made the point that some of the more recent ones could have resulted in breaking our code, or at least one of our codes. Second, as far as the CIA was concerned, they made the point that some of their sources were revealed, and in fact some of their sources did dry up. And third, very interestingly enough, a careful reading of some of the Pentagon documents would indicate that a Russian agent would have been able to find that we had successfully bugged Brezhnev's automobile, because some of the information in there came from a conversation that took place in his automobile. And further, that we had broken the North Vietnamese code. Now, put yourself in the position of the Russians, who, from reports we had received a copy of this, a full copy of this, even before the New York Times got it. Or the position of the North Vietnamese. They get this information, they know that their codes have been compromised, they're able to change them. And also, if they're reading our secret codes, they're able to develop their policies accordingly. Just let me sum it up. The Pentagon Papers, even if they should not have been classified, it was a breach of the law for Mr. Ellsberg on his own to determine what should be made public. That was a violation of the law.
Whatever the extenuating circumstances and whatever his intentions may have been, in your opinion, did Daniel Ellsberg betray his country?
In my opinion, Daniel Ellsberg gave, let me put the question again.
Despite the extenuating circumstances and whatever his intentions may have been, in your opinion, did Daniel Ellsberg betray his country?
I would put it another way. Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy. And under those circumstances, that is inexcusable. And I would say, second, as a result of what he did, he who was a self-proclaimed anti-war activist, although, as Henry Kissinger pointed out, he had been a super hawk at the beginning of the war, that Daniel Ellsberg, as an anti-war activist, what he did encouraged the enemy. It had the effect, again, of making the enemy more intransigent at the conference table by bringing home to them the fact that there was division in the war here. And under the circumstances, it prolonged the war and it cost American lives without any question, in my opinion.
Because Daniel Ellsberg stole the Pentagon Papers and because the New York Times published them, do you think that American lives were lost in Vietnam?
I think the war was prolonged. I think that the negotiations, which were very much underway at that point in secret channels and Dr. Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho, I think those negotiations did not make the progress they could have made. There's no doubt in my mind, but that gave enormous boost to the idea that the North Vietnamese had that they could win in the United States, particularly in Washington, D.C., the victory politically that they could not win in the battlefield. And it made them resist making the decision they eventually made to agree to a settlement.
In your memoirs, you write that one of the most moving events of your presidency was at the time when all the POWs came to Washington for the dinner you gave them at the White House. That afternoon, you had all the POWs to the State Department auditorium for a briefing in which you filled them in on the things that had happened during their captivity. During that briefing, you referred, not by name, but very clearly to Ellsberg, and the reaction on the part of the POWs was very dramatic. We have a clip of that event.
I think it is time in this country to quit making national heroes out of those who steal secrets and publish them in the newspapers.
What do you think should have been done to Daniel Ellsberg?
Well, I think what should have been done, unfortunately, failed. because our legal processes didn't turn out to be as acceptable as they should have been. He should have gone to prison for what he did.
One of the reasons he didn't was because over Labor Day weekend, well, I shouldn't say that because one can't prejudge what the jury would have decided, but the reason the case was dismissed, one of the reasons the case was dismissed, was because over Labor Day weekend 1971, 2 White House aides broke into the office of his psychiatrist, presumably to look into the medical records to find out about his motivations, about his sources, about things he was privy to and what he intended to do with this material. Looking back, do you think that the Ellsberg break-in was justified on national security grounds?
I would say that as far as the break-in is concerned, I cannot recall it ever having come to my attention or my having approved it. And as I look at what happened there, breaking into a psychiatrist's office, it seems to me to be a bizarre move to take. However, we have to understand that as far as those who did undertake it was concerned, that we had some indications that Ellsberg was a somewhat unstable personality. Henry Kissinger said that he was brilliant, he knew him at Harvard, but that he tended to be erratic and emotionally unstable. And Ellsberg had also indicated in this clip we just saw that he would like to get out information with regard to some of the current activities we were engaged in. Now let us understand, at this very time, the Pentagon Papers, for example, came out 2 weeks before Henry Kissinger took his secret trip to China. If that trip had been exposed, the cover would have been blown, we might not have had the China Initiative. That's one reason for secrecy there. It took place at a time that Kissinger was engaged in secret conversations with the North Vietnamese in Paris. As a result of this particular exposure, that is the Pentagon Papers exposure, as I've already indicated, I believe that they became more intransigent at the conference table. At least when we look at the records there, they certainly cooled off on any moves that they might have been made in terms of a reasonable settlement. So under the circumstances, it is, I think, understandable as to why people who had the responsibility, which Bud Krogh and his associates, he was the young man who was in charge of that particular investigation, it is understandable that they wanted to do everything they possibly could to find out what made him tick. They considered he was a potential leak in the future, and that a leak in the future might jeopardize one of our major foreign policy initiatives.
How did you feel when Bud Krogh went to prison and Daniel Ellsberg went free?
Well, I thought it was a terrible miscarriage of justice. I mean, Bud Krogh is an outstanding servant of our administration. He did a magnificent job in everything we gave him to do. He was one of my favorite young men among many young men in that White House staff. And I am delighted now that he is back in the practice of law and very, very successful. He certainly deserves everything that he has. He has not been made a national hero, and Ellsberg has. He would not be welcomed, I'm sure, as Ellsberg be, in the high areas of our great university think tanks and so forth. But as far as he's concerned, he's a real man. I wouldn't say that for Ellsberg.
I think we can, sorry, go ahead.
Debbie, I want to, go ahead. No.
Can we go on for a minute?
We just ran out of tape. We've got to change reels if you want to change.
We're up to the time, why don't we break?
Then
We
we'll
have
do it.
about 2 minutes of tape on the machine, but I'm afraid it'll tear at the end. I'd rather change reels.
Okay.
Let's
We
break.
can do it. I have a thought. I'll catch it when I get
Okay, we've done 2 hours. Let's break for lunch and come back.
Okay, fine.
Okay.